Men, when they get a family, when they get a wife and they have children, they work really hard at accumulating resources to pass down as a legacy to their offspring for their future generations. So to preserve their, from a strictly atheist worldview, you would see it as passing your genetic material into the future. From a Christian worldview, we see it more as like leaving a patriarchal legacy of provision and protection for your future generations. And she didn't want any of that. She said, everyone's allegiance should be to the state. And fathers get in the way of that, so they have to be removed.
Welcome to the Renaissance of Men podcast. My name is Will Spencer. My guest this week is Rachel Wilson, and she's a mother of 5, a patriarchalist, and the author of the excellent book, Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. She went digging into history and found that women have not been as historically oppressed as we've been told. The authentic history of women has been scrubbed from textbooks by second and third wave feminists seeking to cement their historical narrative of women as cosmic victims. Then, and here's the crucial part, these feminists covered the tracks of their first-wave feminist forebears, many of whom were occultists, theosophists, Kabbalists, and mystics, not to mention Marxists and communists. And they were funded by wealthy industrialists, the elites who were into many of these same practices. In other words, as hard as this may be to believe, and I'll say it slowly, first-wave feminism and Luciferianism are inextricably linked. So if you're still struggling to free yourself from the illusion of first-wave feminism as merely about politics or economics, please go pick up Rachel Wilson's book, Occult Feminism. Through her vital work of reading the primary source documents herself, she uncovered that the true history of feminism is of anti-Christian spiritual warfare. May the truths that she's discovered set you free. In our conversation, Rachel and I discussed her upbringing and background, the anti-suffrage movement and the truth of Susan B. Anthony, feminism's false promises of safety to women, Christianity versus Americanism, how our culture fearmongers motherhood, and Rachel's work with Pearl from JustPearlyThings. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe. Plus, leave a comment down below letting us know if you've accepted the truth about first-wave feminism. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, the author of Occult Feminism, Rachel Wilson. Rachel, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So my listeners know that back in February of this year, I did a presentation called Exiting the New Age. So I had spent about 20 years wandering through the New Age until I finally found my way to Christ in 2020, the great blessing of my life. And so earlier this year, I did a long presentation sort of taking the New Age apart. And the day that I gave the presentation, I discovered your book. And
oh, wow.
It was too late for
spooky.
It was super spooky. I was actually kind of frustrated. I was like, oh, wow, because you talked about, Annie Besant and Alice Bailey and the Theosophical Society, all of which I got into. And so I wasn't able to incorporate any of your material, but I did get to put it on screen. So I've been looking forward to talking to you since then to dig into the subject matter of the book.
Well, that's excellent to hear. I never got a chance to dabble in any of that sort of stuff myself. I was raised Christian and probably one of the rarer cases of people that didn't ever have a big falling away and then come back or something like that. But yeah. I certainly didn't expect to find when I started research for this book 4 years ago now that, I thought it was going to be a book about the economic aspects of feminism and who funded it and things like that. And as I was profiling most of the famous earlier suffragettes and feminist activists from the 1800s, around the Victorian era, I was really surprised to find that most, not just a few, but most of them were into theosophy, esotericism of various forms. And I thought, well, this seems to be a really huge influence, so I can't leave that out. So it really had to be a part of the story. I don't think it's not often included in the mainstream academic, version of feminist history, but it was a huge, huge influence on feminism itself. So I definitely had to cover that in the book.
So before we get into the book, can we talk a little bit about your background? I see you've been on Fox News, and did that help influence some of the research here? How did you decide to write a book on feminism in the first place?
Yeah, it's kind of strange. The Fox News thing happened after everything and is kind of unrelated to the feminist stuff. So I'll try to kind of explain briefly. I was actually raised by I think I had a kind of typical Gen X setup where I had a very feminist, Marxist, educated mother, and then
Mhm.
kind of like a conservative patriot Rush Limbaugh dad, right?
Mhm.
And to
Interesting.
the surprise of no one, that didn't work out, and they divorced when I was a child.
Did not
So
see that coming.
yeah, who could have seen it, right? But it gave me these two different worlds growing up, right? To I be with my mom and hear like one version of her worldview, and then be with my dad and hear a completely different one. And as a kid, you're not political or anything like that. You're just trying to make sense of stuff. And I saw what that did to my mother and didn't think I wanted to follow that. And I saw the cognitive dissonance as well. So when I got out of the house at 19. But I made the typical mistake that most of us make because of the culture we live in, which is I can just move in with my boyfriend. We'll get married. We're going to get married. It's going to happen. But
Mm.
we can just move in together because it's practical and we can pay the bills and I don't have to live with my parents anymore. And had my first daughter at 20, which was a surprise, but I was very happy because I always thought I would have children at some point. And I thought, well, it's a little sooner than I thought, but this is all fine, right? That didn't quite work out for me. Another
Mm.
shocker, living with your boyfriend is not the best idea. And so he kind of had a different view of what he wanted to do with his life and had some of his own personal issues going on, and he left. So here I am,
Mm.
a single mom at 20. I was already pregnant with number two, and I thought, how did I get here? I fully never intended on being a single mom. I wanted to do anything possible to avoid that for my kids because it wasn't good for me growing up. And I kind of started to just ask a lot of questions about, I wasn't the type of person that you would expect that. I was never promiscuous. I wasn't a huge partier or anything. So I was like, how did I get here? And why is everyone I know a single mom? Why do all of the moms work? Because I didn't want to. As soon as I had my daughter, I really wanted to stay home. And nobody around me supported that either. Because I would say, if I had the choice, if I had like a husband who was financially stable and I could stay home, which is, what I got shortly thereafter by the grace of God, that's what I would do. And I thought it makes no sense for me to pay half of what I make to give that money to someone else, just a different woman, to be a stand in for me all day, every day, to do what I should be doing, which is raise my own children. And when I would say this to the women around me, I would get so much pushback. And I thought, I'm pretty sure I'm making sense. And so I got very good at defending my ideas and my choices. Of course, I did find a really fantastic guy, got remarried, had three more children, stayed home, homeschooled them, which was another thing I had no support in from the people around me, even people who were Christian, who were more conservative. So again, I am defending what I think are like historically very normal values and choices in my life. And everyone around me is telling me it's dangerous. You have to have your own money. You have to have a career because if you don't, your husband's going to become abusive. Or what if he leaves you? And just all this fear mongering about motherhood and staying home and homeschooling. What if your kids turn out weird? What if they don't get properly educated? Just all of So I got very good at like arguing these things to people and defending my own choices, which is kind of how I got into the idea of writing the book. My kids started to get older. My oldest three became adults, and I'm in my mid 40s now. And so I said to my husband, the kids we're almost done. Like we only have 6, 7 more years before they're all adults. Maybe I should think about, what I want to do. I want to be a very involved grandmother and work with my church and things, but I have a lot of talents. And what do you think I should do? And he said, you're really good at kind of defending motherhood and homeschooling and knocking down feminism, and almost no women are doing that. Maybe you should write a book or something. And I had other friends at the time like Aaron Clary, who's an author and a streamer, and he was like, I really think you should throw your hat in the ring and give it a shot. So I thought, okay, I don't know if anyone's ever going to read this book, but I'll put one together and see what happens. So the book came out, and the next month it didn't do a lot, because I don't have a publisher. It's self-published. I thought maybe no one but my dad and I would ever read it. And a month after, I got asked by the editor of the Gab News blog to write a piece about homeschooling during the pandemic, because we saw this huge rise in homeschooling because of that. It was kind of an unexpected consequence of lockdowns. So I wrote this article and it kind of went viral. And the producers from Tucker Carlson saw it and asked if I would come on and talk about that. So that's actually what my Tucker appearance was about homeschooling and kind of taking back the culture via reclaiming motherhood and educating our own children rather than having the state raise our kids and educate them. So after that, of course, the book picked up steam because I was getting a lot of exposure on social media, and it's kind of been going nuts ever since then. So just right place, right time a little bit. And also, I think because the red pill, like dating shows are so popular right now, and there's very few women on my side of the aisle at all, and even less of us are approaching it from kind of a historic academic kind of an approach.
Mhm. Yeah, it sounds like a confluence of a bunch of factors. I think
Yeah,
that there are a lot of men and women. Well, men have been asking questions about feminism for a while. That's the origin of the red pill, which has its origins in the pickup days, right? Where they
yeah,
discover their big quote unquote sociological experiment about how feminism was lying. And then that all got adapted into red pill. And now it's spreading to women who are finally asking questions about feminism the same way you have. It's like, why
yeah,
am I getting pushback when I say I want to stay home with my kids? What's going
yeah.
on there?
Yeah, just this, there's a very anti-natalist attitude that
Yeah.
goes along with all of this that, I mean, we've been dealing with that for over a century now, this idea that humans are bad for the planet and babies are going to, somehow contribute to climate change or overpopulation. And so the rhetoric is very anti-child. Like every female comedian, a lot of sitcoms, a lot of the pop culture stuff is very like, ew, children are icky and what do you want to be, just a baby factory? I mean, some of the things that
Mm.
people say to me on social media are pretty rough. So I know I can be a little bit provocative on Twitter sometimes, but believe me, it's not like any of the women who don't like my ideas are kind to me either.
No.
They make all kinds of assumptions. I must be stupid. I must be lazy. I just couldn't hack it in the career world. I must be brainwashed or be in an abusive marriage. Like all these kinds of just presumptions that if you're not a feminist, you are the one who broke the sisterhood and you are the one who must have an issue, that kind of a thing.
And I think more and more women are encountering that. They're looking at their lives in the career world or looking at the lives of women who are a generation ahead of them in the career world and seeing that they're unfulfilled, they're lonely, they're depressed, so antidepressant use is skyrocketing, etc. And they're trying to find another path to travel. And as soon as they start to change and start to make another path of being a homemaker, of being a mother, they experience all this pushback in the
Yeah.
same way that you. It's like, what's going on there?
Yeah, it's very wild when you think you're saying something that seems so natural. You have this precious baby and you're so in love with your newborn, and the last thing you want to do is be separated from your brand new child for hours a day, maybe 40, 50 hours a week. And it's like, oh, I get to see my child a couple hours in the evening and maybe a little on the weekend, and then the rest of my life is about working and waging and paying taxes and increasing the GDP or something like that. And yeah, it's very, like, you start to just ask yourself why, like, how did we get here? How is this the normal thing? And then, when I did start doing some research and I found, oh, we have crashing birth rates. There's no risk of overpopulation. We've been well below replacement for decades in most of the world. Why don't I ever hear about that? And then you see, studies where they say that in just 3 to 4 more years, we're going to be in a situation where half of women are not going to have children in the West.
Yeah.
Half. That's never historically happened. And you think that can't be good, right? So why is the whole culture telling me that, I'm a loser for wanting to stay home with my child? I've had people say things to me like, oh, it's such a shame you never did anything with your life. People who think they're my friends, like these are women who think they're
What?
my friends. Yeah, and they went off to university and got degrees, and they maybe
Mhm.
had one child, and their attitude towards me is, oh, Rachel, you're so smart and you're so talented. It's such a shame you never did anything with any of that. And I would just be like, first of all, ouch. Like,
Yeah.
why did you think that was okay to say? But second of all, I've raised 5 really great human beings who all turned out to be like high achieving, very functional, very mature, educated, very moral people who are going to go off into the world and make it better. Why is that not a valid thing to do with my life? So, yeah, and it kind of made me mad. I
Hmm.
get a little frustrated with it. So, I guess, my husband's idea about it was most women don't want to go against that grain. They don't want
Yep.
to be the only fish swimming upstream when all the other fish are swimming downstream. And he's like, you kind of have a thick skin about it. And you can kind of take it pretty well. Therefore, since I understand these things, since I have this information, since I've spent years studying how we got here, it's kind of like I have a bit of an obligation to dispel some of the myths and to make life more comfortable for women who are trying to do what I'm trying to do, right? And luckily, that's the feedback I've gotten. I get messages daily, multiple messages on social media, through my email, on my YouTube channel from women saying, I want to be a stay-at-home mom and I just had a child and I don't want to go back to work and my mother doesn't approve or my sister thinks it's a bad idea, and you've kind of helped me find a way to articulate, a good reasoning behind my choices as well, and you've given me some confidence in doing that. So that's really all I'm trying to do, is not take rights away from women and force them back into the kitchen and chain them to a stove. No, no, no. It's more just I want it to be a valid and venerated choice to dedicate yourself to motherhood in a serious way, to be proud of being a good wife, to have a spirit of appreciation and cooperation with your husband rather than the spirit of like combativeness and cooperation. So to me, it's pretty sensible, it's pretty historically normal, yet in this day and time I'm kind of like all alone on one side of the spectrum here with just a handful of other women. So
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot more soon, but I appreciate you highlighting that the most extreme pushback comes from women. The
yeah,
sisterhood, it's a real thing, and you try and point it out, the way that women can be absolutely vicious to each other about these issues. There's almost nothing that's less tolerated on social media than to actually point out the existence of the sisterhood that keeps women locked into this way of being, because women are so agreeable. Like, as Jordan Peterson says, trait agreeableness, women are naturally higher in it. So they don't
yeah.
want to break that sisterhood, but there's such an honorable cadre of women that are trying to do that, that are doing that. And I regard them as very brave to do so.
Yeah, it's not easy. I will tell you
Hmm.
that. I get plenty of hate. I have a whole folder of hate mail on my phone that sometimes I like to read it for chuckles just to
Hmm.
show how insane and like what the cognitive dissonance looks like. It's like women who are telling me that they're feminists because they want women to be heard, they want them to have choice, they want them to be free to do what they want to do with their life, are the same women saying, I hope your husband cheats on you. I can't wait until he leaves you. I hope your children grow up and never speak to you again. You should never be on social media. Get off social media. And I'm just like, wait, everyone else has every woman's voice deserves to be heard except for mine, apparently, so it's endless cognitive dissonance, and all you have to do is just be a little bit rational to just knock it down endlessly. And that's one of the reasons I do a lot of live stream debates,
Hmm.
because number one, it's fun for me. It's like a kind of a competitive intellectual sport, but also because it's a very good way to highlight how irrational the entire ideology is, how when you try to poke logical holes in it, it completely collapses. It's not that hard to do. It's just that very few people want to stick their neck out and do it.
Yeah, it's very emotionally charged. And I think
Yeah.
some of that your book helped me understand, because whenever I see something these days irrational that's highly emotionally charged, I naturally start thinking there's some sort of spiritual manipulation going
Yeah.
on. Right? People don't get worked up over intellectual ideas, and I think you put your finger on something in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. In the book I say, it wasn't me who said it actually. I quote Susanna Budapest, who is she was one of the first witches to legally have a witch coven in the United States. She
Hmm.
came here from the Czech Republic in the 60s, I believe. left communism there, came here and went to San Francisco, where things were pretty liberal, and she fought for religious freedom because witchcraft was actually illegal here until the 70s. And she had a witch coven that was open in public, and it was challenged, and she went to court and said, we have religious freedom here. You can't tell me I can't be a witch. And she won. And she said that feminism is simply the political arm of a spiritual battle. It's just the political arm of this greater spiritual warfare we're in. And that's why I had to explain how these early feminists saw Christianity as the enemy, because they saw it as patriarchal and oppressive, and they saw Lucifer as their liberator openly. People may not know that these seemingly benign figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady, the typical suffragettes that we all hear about, and they're only ever spoken of in a positive light. I mean, for Pete's sake, President Trump posthumously pardoned Susan B. Anthony for her illegal voting stuff that she was doing. They're just spoken of as these sweet little ladies who were just, trying to help the women. And it's like, no, they were openly declaring Lucifer as their mascot, as their symbol of being a liberator. And people aren't aware that there's this deeper philosophical and religious and spiritual ideology underpinning all of this stuff.
Well, let's get into that, because, when you start pushing back on feminism, you'll get a lot of feminists to say, oh, all the man-hating stuff, that's just all radical feminism. That's since the 1960s. Like, before that, it was just about equal rights. That's really what it was about. So that seems to be that period of time, the late 1800s, early 1900s, seems to have branded itself as like, that's the pure feminism. And that's one of my favorite parts of your book, is like, you show that's not exactly what was going on. So let's start there, and maybe we can work our way forwards in time and show how this theme of occultism has wound its way to today.
Yeah. So this is probably the thing I talk about the most, because it's the least well known. And when people find out this information, they're pretty shocked, and a lot of times in some disbelief. And it's like, wait, I have to look into this, because who's this random lady, and why should I trust her, and why should I believe her? And I knew when this book came out that the claims were going to be highly contested. So I was very methodical in citing all of my sources. And I've done even a lot more since the book came out in that regard. But yeah, it was never the grassroots movement that everyone's been told it was. So if you do a man on the street and just ask a random person, what do you think life was like for women before they got the vote, right? You'll get a general answer of, oh, it was slavish, and they were oppressed, and they had no freedom, and they couldn't do anything, and they were just stuck in their house. And I'll even hear things like people will assert, oh, women couldn't read, they weren't allowed to go to school, they could never have a job or own anything. That's really what people think. None of that is true. So I take a few chapters in the book to debunk that, but I think it's really important to understand, why do people think that? Why does the general public have this idea that life for women prior to 1920 was, nasty, brutish, and short, this kind of awful existence? And there's a very good reason. All of the anti-suffrage movement, all of the kind of nasty truth about the early first wave feminist movement has been removed from textbooks. It has been literally removed from the historical record by women's studies departments at universities who gatekeep the information. And their reasoning of why this is okay is something called standpoint theory. Now, standpoint theory is the idea that comes from Marxism. It was developed by just three women, primarily Sandra Harding and then two other ladies she was working with, who, of course, are all Rockefeller funded, that they developed this Marxist theory that the truth, any idea of objective truth, or that there's an objective historical timeline, is not only problematic, but dangerous. And we either need to do away with the idea of historical truth altogether, or we need to radically redefine it. So standpoint theory says, sure, the history looks a certain way, but that's only because you're not looking at it from the standpoint of the oppressed woman. So they bake all these presumptions into what an oppressed woman is, and then they literally rewrite the history to fit that narrative. Now, they think that this is perfectly justified because they're basing it on Marxist philosophy and postmodernism and lots of deep philosophical stuff. I've got a podcast coming out in maybe 6 weeks with Joseph Everett from the What I've Learned YouTube channel, where we go like super deep on that, if in case anybody wants to. It's kind of nerdy. But basically, they felt justified in rewriting the history because they wanted it to be told how they wanted it to be told. Now, this isn't just me saying this. There's a professor who I believe he's passed now, but his name was Joseph C. Miller, and he's a historian. Most of his work centers around like slavery history and things like that, but he also does quite a bit on feminism and suffrage. And he had a whole piece that he wrote which displayed this. He took the 13 mainline textbooks that have been used in universities over the last century or so, and he documented how early on there was a lot in the textbooks about the anti-suffrage movement, which people don't know was much bigger than the pro-suffrage movement.
Yep.
There were always far more women involved in anti-suffrage groups. They had membership in these groups. They would debate the suffragettes. There was far bigger participation among women in anti-suffrage groups than pro-suffrage groups. Suffragists would actually block referendums letting women vote on whether they wanted to vote. Like, can you imagine more irony than that? And the reason is because there were a couple referendums that were done around the turn of the century in states like Massachusetts, where only 4% of women said they wanted to vote. And there were brilliant arguments and pamphlets and political tracts written by anti-suffrage women who had very valid and wonderful arguments as to why they didn't want the vote. And the suffragettes didn't like that. And they had a PR problem anyway, because a lot of the people who were at the forefront of the suffrage movement were highly unlikable. They tended to be free love advocates, prostitutes, or unmarried women who never had children, things of that nature. So they didn't want these referendums going on at all because it just really looked bad and it just made suffrage for women more and more unpopular. So they blocked those referendums. So the people saying women deserve to have the vote, but don't let them vote on whether they want the vote, because they just don't know what's good for them, right? They just don't know what's really good for them. So we can't let them vote on it, but they should vote. And it was crazy. And this is why it was so unpopular for so long, because people aren't that stupid. And they would look at this and be like, this is bizarre. The reason people have the presumptions they do about history, and even women who will go and get a gender studies degree or a women's studies degree will be like, Rachel, you're wrong. I paid $40,000 for a master's degree in women's studies, and that's not the information I got. How could you possibly have the correct information? And it's because I took years of digging into the actual primary sources through things like the Rockefeller archives. Some of the stuff that's been preserved, there are lots of anti-suffrage tracts and pamphlets that have been preserved. And then people like Joseph Miller who have put that stuff out there. And then I also spent a really long amount of time reading the actual writings of the suffragettes and the feminist activists of the 1800s myself, which is why I don't feel bad about asking for money for my book, because let me tell you, if you have to sit here and read a bunch of Alice Bailey and Annie Besant and Margaret Fuller and Mary Wollstonecraft, I'm taking one for the team, you guys. I read all that stuff so that you don't have to, because it's terrible. It's awful. It's really, it's also really, really radical. So a lot of the stuff that you're seeing now that people think is new, like the gender abolition stuff, the you can transform into anything that you want to transform into stuff, this all comes out of this period in the 1800s when there were dozens, in fact, over 80 experimental utopian socialist communities in the United States alone. And these people were experimenting with gender swapping and switching gender roles and things like vegan diets and the stuff that seems like it's new and recent. Oh no, it was all going on back then in these communities. And what happened is, during the Industrial Revolution, we got these extremely wealthy philanthropists, right? the Gilded Age billionaires of the world who had nouveau riche money that people really hadn't had up until that time, and they saw an opportunity to use universities and then later entities like the United Nations to capture these institutions and use them for social engineering. And feminism was one of the main things they wanted to push. Now, why did they want to push that, right? That's the second question people ask. Well, Rachel, but why? Why, if women didn't want to be liberated from marriage and family and motherhood, then how did we get here? How did we get all of this, right? Well, if you were a wealthy Gilded Age industrialist who had, most of these people went on to be senators or presidents or vice presidents, or were closely entangled with the most powerful people of the time, those people needed lots of cheap labor. You have all these factories expanding. You need a larger pool of cheaper labor. And at first they tried to do that with immigration, bringing in, low-wage immigrants, but there just wasn't really enough. They couldn't get enough fast enough. And there was some objection to mass immigration at the time. So they thought, well, if we could get the women out of the home and into the factories, we can get lots of cheap labor overnight. And then there were two other benefits to this. In 1913, the same little handful of people who funded suffrage were the same handful of people who went to the Jekyll Island Club in 1913 and created the Federal Reserve System, the income tax, and kind of snuck it through over the Christmas holiday in a very sneaky way. And they thought, okay, this is another great thing about feminism. If we can push women out of the home and convince them that they need to have their own money and they can have more income, and you don't want to stay at home all day with kids, you want to go work in a factory. Doesn't that sound great, ladies? Well, now we've also doubled our income tax base overnight. And then the third benefit is, okay, if both parents are off working in the factories, where are the kids going to go? Well, they had just also built this compulsory public education system. And the public education system came out of the Prussian model, which was designed to create very good soldiers and very good factory workers who were conditioned to show up on time, respond when the bell rings. You take your break when the bell rings, you go to lunch when the bell rings. When the bell rings again, you come back to work, and you're trained and conditioned to do these things for the state on behalf of the state. So if the moms are at work, we can say, oh, they have to go to the state-run public education system now, where the state can indoctrinate the children with whatever views are conducive to state control, to expanding the welfare system. And this worked really well. If you take the number of out-of-wedlock births from 1960 to 2010 and plot them on a graph, they go up like this. It was only about 5% of children were born out of wedlock in 1960. By 2010, that number became 41%. Now, if you take a look at welfare spending and you plot that on a graph over the same time period, in 1960, it was about, I think, 50 billion. And then by 2010, it goes all the way up to 700 billion. So you have a 10.5 time increase in out-of-wedlock births. You have a 12-time increase in welfare spending. So what that did was effectively replace fathers and husbands with the state, with the welfare state. And that's where we are now. So this was all done through institutional capture of, using the university systems to kind of indoctrinate and rewrite the history and push certain social engineering things like feminism onto the public. And then I also talk about the CIA's involvement in culture creation and pushing feminism as well.
It's almost unbelievable to look at, except you documented it so thoroughly. And I've read other supporting material around it where it's like, no, this really happened. This wasn't made up. This is our sanitized history that gets broadcast to us through the media so we believe that we know what happened before us.
Yeah. And so that we believe that all of these radical changes, I mean, people might think, why focus on feminism? Like, we all know it's kind of, most people think, oh, feminism kind of lame, but whatever, I guess it was good, right? So why get your panties in a twist about feminism, Rach? Well, because we have taken a social order that existed for all of human history up until 100 years ago. And in just one century, we've completely inverted that entire social order, turned it inside out, flipped it upside down. There is no other revolution in human history, not even, the Industrial Revolution enabled this, but even that in and of itself alone, I would argue, did not have the same impact that feminism has had in completely dismantling the family unit, completely destroying the idea of what men are and what masculinity is, of what leadership is, of what governance is, of how children are raised, what a home is, what education looks like. I mean, just every area of your modern life is completely and totally affected by this revolutionary change that happened in such a short period of time. And it explains so much of the social ills that we're dealing with right now. We wonder why are 26% of adult American women on at least one prescription psychiatric medication? Why, when you look at the DSMs prior to 1970, mental illness, depression, self-deletion among children was extremely rare, to the point that they barely put it in there because it was just so rare. And it's not that they didn't know of it or couldn't diagnose it. No, we've had psychiatry and psychology for longer, about as long as we've had feminism. It's actually gone up due to a lot of these changes, this complete instability that children are growing up in. And really, that's my main motivation. My main motivation for doing this is because it's heartbreaking when you look at the statistics of what's going on with kids and how they're being raised, the risks they're exposed to because women don't think that kids need their father anymore. Women don't think they need a husband anymore. And we think that you can just raise kids however, and they'll grow up fine and they'll survive and it'll be great. But broken children grow up to be broken adults who don't know how to live. So a lot of the societal decay we're dealing with is a direct result of this.
One of the famous quotes in the New Age world, I don't know who originated it, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So that's something that they say, and what they're trying to say by that is that patriarchy is the sick part, and we have to move towards this kind of like feminist kind of ideal, feminist environmentalist ideal. Yeah. And so to actually, the way that you lay it out, it's like, no, the feminist environmentalist ideal is the sick part that we're just trying. If we just get 100% of the way there, then it'll be fine, right? Mark of a scam, right? We need to go back the other direction. But it seems so. It's that emotional hold, that emotional interpretation of history that women were so enslaved and oppressed and so held down and so disrespected for every century prior to 1900 that it's unthinkable for people. And the title of the book is Occult Feminism. Again, I wonder if you can go into a little bit of the occult aspects, because it's hard not to see black magic at the root of all of this.
Yes, exactly. So especially if you've come out of the New Age, people who have like a New Age background, they grasp onto what I'm talking about really fast.
Yeah, I lived it.
Yeah, they're like, oh, this ties together all the dots for me. Yeah. The title of the book kind of has a twofold meaning. The first one's the most obvious, that a lot of these women had these beliefs because they had this underlying occultic, esoteric belief structure of some kind. So a lot of the women were theosophists, they were spirit mediums, they were fortune tellers, they were, a lot of them came out of Crowleyan circles. Many of them were into like the Eastern mystery religions or Hermeticism, the Golden Dawn, things like that. The other reason I called it occult feminism is because there is actually literally a secret hidden history to feminism that's been tucked away and obscured by these women's studies departments who only want it to be portrayed in a certain light. And Susan B. Anthony herself, who wrote her own self-glorifying 4-volume puff piece about the history of women's liberation, because of course she saw herself as being the hero of it, so she wanted to document it. She says right in the first chapter of the first volume that if it had been up to women, women's liberation would have never happened. The vote would have never passed. And she said the reason for this isn't so much like you might think, oh, they're brainwashed to like their captivity or something. But she said it's not so much that. It's really that they're actually too happy. Their lives are too nice. They have all this provision and protection under male suffrage that they don't want to lose. They have a privileged place in society as mothers where they're well respected and they don't have to deal with a lot of the harsh realities of life that men do. Of course, life throughout history was tough for both sexes in different ways. It's not that everything was always roses, but I'm saying, comparatively, her analysis was women have it too good. They can go to school if they want to. New England women had a 90% literacy rate by 1750. So if you're under this impression that they weren't allowed to read or write or go to school, that's completely false. Women have dominated education and literacy for about 3 centuries in the Western world. And she said, if it's up to them, they'll never do it. And the other reason is they're very conservative. The women at the time tended to be less revolutionary and less and more conservative than the men. And this is because they wanted a stable society to raise children in. They wanted a nice, clean park for their children to play in. They wanted churches. They wanted community. They wanted peace. They wanted this nice, stable, healthy society to raise children in. And they don't like all this wild revolution stuff. They don't like the idea of free love, which was very tied in with suffrage. You had people like Victoria Woodhull, who had like a prostitution ring that she used to spy on Wall Street and rig the stock market with. And a lot of other characters like that women didn't want to be associated with. Women felt they had the moral high ground because they weren't a political voting bloc. They said, we are not partisan. We don't have to pick the red team or the blue team, the right wing or the left wing. We can be concerned with higher moral questions that transcend politics. And we don't want to lose that moral high ground. So Susan B. Anthony said, you can't leave it up to them. They're never going to go for it. We have to get the men, the wealthy industrialist men who have a stake in this, to push it and to fund it and to kind of force it. And she was fine with that because her idea was eventually the women will get with the program. They'll become more progressive. They'll start to see patriarchy as oppressive. And she was right about that, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. She was right about the fact that over time we can probably use propaganda and just push this to the point that women will begin to have these ideas and agree with us. It took a while, though. A lot of people don't know that when suffrage was first passed, very few women voted. They really had no interest. They saw politics as kind of dirty business, which it kind of is. And it wasn't until the late 80s, I believe, that women became the biggest voting bloc and now vote in larger numbers than men do. Mm-hmm. So the occult stuff kind of has a twofold meaning, but the reason it's at the root of the ideology, and you see this going all the way back to ancient times. So the book starts there. The book starts way back in like ancient Sumer with goddess worship and temple prostitution, and follows it through like the Middle Ages and the Renaissance a little bit. And then we get to the Protestant Revolution in the West, and then the French Revolution, the American Revolution, this whole revolutionary period that came along with the Age of Reason, which was based on kind of rejection of church authority, rejection of government authority, rejection of hierarchy altogether. This revolutionary spirit that bore Marxism and all of these esoteric religions coming into the West when they've always kind of been there, but they never dominated before. So it kind of it's wonderful if you're a feminist, right? If you've been convinced of this women's oppression narrative, you do look at Christianity and go, God the Father? Well, who says? So you have like Ariana Grande with songs like, God is a woman, or you have all these vengeful, wrathful pop singer girls, talking about female empowerment and women's sexual liberation and sexual power. And it's not a coincidence. It's because underlying that is this idea that women should be the divine ones, that there's this divine goddess, mother earth thing, which is why you always see veganism tied in with the feminism, right? It's like, why? How come all the girls go off to university and they go in normal and they come out blue-haired vegan feminists? Well, this is why, because they're convinced of this kind of esoteric Gnostic principle that Mother Earth and nature is Edenic and good, right? And that it's the male demiurge figure, it's the toxic masculinity, it's the inherent violent nature of men that then comes in and exploits the animals and exploits the women. And so what's the answer to this? Well, you kind of see it in the Barbie movie, which just came out, right? Which is this idea that when the women run everything, it's a utopian world where everything is perfect. There's no death, there's no decay, there's no corruption, until the patriarchy comes in And then it becomes stupid and silly and violent and brutish and dumb and nothing works, right? And so in order to restore that Edenic natural state, we have to return to the goddess, which is where you see like the psychedelic movements of the 70s and 80s coming in with Terence McKenna saying, we have to return to the goddess. Just take psychedelics until all your boundaries dissolve and then, submit to the divine feminine, and then we'll have world peace, right? And I've written a couple of pieces that take some time to dispel this myth that women are more benevolent with power than men are, because it's completely not supported in any of the statistics we have. So when women are in charge of, say, a juvenile prison or a women's prison or any other instance where women do have something of a monopoly on force, they're every bit as much likely as men to exploit that and abuse it, if not more. And I have some theories on why that is. But yeah, it's just this anti-Christian, kind of the Abrahamic religions altogether, you could argue, but since I'm an Orthodox Christian, I mainly see it as this like rebellion against God the Father is really what it is at the heart of it. And that's why all of the other esoteric and occultic religions are so appealing to feminists. They love the idea of vengeful goddesses who, have men's heads around their necks like the goddess Kali does, or they love the idea of Lilith, this vengeful spirit that haunts men in their sleep and is a succubus. They like these vengeful female goddess tales. It's a great like empowerment motif for them that's really attractive. So that's why if you go on TikTok, hashtag witch talk, oh, you'll find all the stuff I'm talking about. Or you go to Instagram, same thing, witchstagram, hashtag, you'll find women doing all kinds of rituals with crystals and all kinds of other kind of gross things that we probably don't want to talk about. But yeah, they love this wrathful goddess revenge porn fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they believe that they're cosmic victims. That's the feminist theology, right? And
Exactly.
so, and that legitimizes the violence, which and women, women and men have different senses of honor. Maybe you can speak about this. Men have a sense of honor, and that they won't actually commit violence against a woman unless they're really furiously angry and completely uncalibrated jerks to begin with.
Right.
Women don't seem to have a problem committing violence against men and other women. They don't seem to have the same moral constraints on them. I don't fully understand that, not being a woman myself, but it shows up in this feminist literature and Susan B. Anthony like actively looking down on women in a way that she would accuse the men of doing.
Right.
Oh, they can't think for themselves. Like, that's okay if Susan B. Anthony says it, but it's not okay if a man says that. Like, how does that work? I don't understand it.
Yeah, so you're always going to run into this cognitive dissonance in feminism, and that's honestly why I believe they go crazy as they get older. You can't hold opposing worldviews like that and constantly be trying to reconcile them without kind of losing your marbles. But I think the reason we see this willingness in women to use violence, and if you're not aware of the statistics, folks, the most recent Substack article I wrote goes over this in detail. And I think, my theory is that men from a very young age, through rough and tumble play with their dads when they're little kids, or with each other, or with older brothers or bigger boys when they're little kids, they learn early on that they can do damage, that even unintentionally, if they get a little out of control, they lose their temper or they get carried away. Oh, shoot, I didn't mean to like make my friend's mouth bleed. I better, I need to learn to keep a wrap on this in some kind of way. And then also men are kind of just held to certain boundaries because men exist and work together within a hierarchy.
Yeah.
So men on a construction site or men in a bar fight will quickly sort out the pecking order, right? Of who can get away with what and who shouldn't probably challenge the other. So men are much more used to understanding where those boundaries are and that there are consequences if they overstep them. Whereas women, we're kind of kept away from that for the most part because women don't work together in a hierarchy. We don't have like a hierarchical order, really. It's more about cooperation in child rearing and community building, but also competition in trying to get the best mate. So, and then we don't get this like, physical play as much when we're kids. We're better at sitting still and being quiet in a desk and doing our homework, which is why girls do so much better in a public school setting than boys do. So I don't think women experience those boundaries. And I think that's why we saw this phenomenon over the last 10 years of there's an Antifa rally and then the Patriot Prayer guys show up and you'll see some girl in flip flops and leggings go up to this 6'2" veteran and like punch him in the face. Right. And you're like, what was she thinking? And it's because they grow up with this, like you said, they're a cosmic victim. They deserve cosmic justice, and then they've never experienced the consequences of what happens. You just walk up and punch a 6'2" man in the face. So I think that's the reason why when women do get power, I don't think they're as acquainted with the consequences of abusing the power. So that's why you see so many stories of like teachers grooming their 13-year-old student, female teachers grooming a 13 or 12-year-old student, and they get a slap on the wrist. Whereas if it's a man doing that to a 12 or 13-year-old girl, he gets the book thrown at him. Kind of different. We have different standards for that sort of stuff. It's very well known statistically that women get far less punishment for the same crimes as men. And that's usually a male judge, who's going easier on the woman, because men are, I believe, inherently benevolent. I don't think they're inherently abusive or inherently oppressive. I think they're inherently benevolent for the most part. Evil exists among people of both sexes, but it's not that men are particularly prone to evil or abuse of power. There's just nothing in any of the data I've ever looked at that really supports that.
Yeah, we're both sinners in need of a savior in different ways, and the vast majority of men are benevolent towards women and benevolent in general, while still being, of course, sinners and depraved and all of those things. We can speak about our social relations as generally wishing good for women and not themselves being desirous of oppressing women. I don't know that society would even have functioned as long as it did if that was the case, nor would you have had women looking forward to their wedding day. How many centuries, like, oh, I can't wait to get married. It's like, why can't wait to get married, but men are these horrible oppressors? Like,
right.
How does that work?
Right. And this wonderful, modern, technologically advanced world that men built that gives women the illusion that they can be in charge of it and don't need the men to begin with is built and maintained by men in large part for our benefit. I mean, I suppose men didn't have to, automate all housework. If they really hated their wives and just wanted them to be enslaved and suffering, I guess they'd say, wash the clothes by hand, you harpy, or whatever. But yeah, it takes a lot of suspension of disbelief to think to yourself that throughout all of human history, with all the love songs and poems we have dating back to ancient times of men expressing their willingness to do anything for the woman they love, talking about their reverence for their own mothers, their love for their daughters, that really what they were doing was just waiting for their first chance to abuse some ladies. They just wake up in the morning and they're like, how can I hurt a woman today? Right. So it's just, like I said, upon just a little bit of investigation, these things fall apart very easily. But if men do it, they're just instantly dismissed and accused of misogyny. So I really think that, ironically, just like how they needed men to push feminism on everybody, I think it's going to take like me and at least a few other women kind of standing up and being rational enough to actually examine these ideas and their outcomes and say, it was a fun experiment, but let's not. It's time for this to end. I think we're done with this now. I think that's what it's going to take, ironically, to kind of dismantle it. And I'm hoping that's the case, because otherwise the historic pattern is you need a collapse. That's the unfortunate part that I don't want to see, because you might have noticed that in a natural disaster or a calamity of some kind, suddenly there's no feminists. When you're trapped in the floodwaters waiting to be rescued, you're not going, boy, I hope the feminists show up and save me. Or if you're in the burning building hoping that a fireman comes to rescue you, you're not like, gosh, when's the gender studies department going to come and rescue me from this fire? So we see this historical trend. Professor Edward Dutton was on my show talking about this, because this is kind of what he researches these historical trends of civilizational, peak and decline. And he said, whenever you get to the peak, it kind of, the feminist stuff starts to come about.
Yeah.
And inevitably, that's the biggest sign that there's going to be an imminent collapse soon, because it doesn't work. Unfortunately, ladies, no matter how much you cast spells with your crystals, men are always going to have the monopoly on physical force. Now, that doesn't mean that, think of it this way. The way I think of it is, prior to women's liberation, there was a bit of a natural balance of power between the sexes in this way. Men have the balance of monopoly of force, right? Men are bigger, they're stronger, they can do things physically that women can't do. But historically, women have been twice as successful at reproducing. So through all the genetic studies we've done, 80% of women who've ever survived past infancy have been able to reproduce. Only 40% of men have ever historically been able to pass on their genetic material. That's one big way that women have a tremendous amount of powers, that we're kind of the gatekeepers of sex and reproduction. So what we did when we made women equal in politics and finance and governance and all of these other things is we kind of threw off that natural balance that was there. And now we have, an entire family court system that's completely biased against men. We have something of an institution of marriage, although I don't think what we have now is really marriage. It's just a state certificate that it's a contract that's easier to break than your cell phone contract. And when it does get broken, 70 to 80% of the time, it's the woman breaking it. So then she takes half the man's resources. She takes the children. She usually gets custody and child support. And then the man has to start over with zero, right, in the middle of his life. And then nobody cares if the children are deprived of their father, because the woman has to be happy. It doesn't matter who has to suffer for mommy to be happy and live, laugh, love, and find herself and whatever it is. Now, there's sometimes that divorce is warranted. Even the church has always historically had certain exceptions for divorce, but it had to be just cause, and it had to be something serious that couldn't be worked through, like abandonment, addiction that was not, successful in being treated, or serious abuse, something like that. I think that's fine. What I'm not in favor of is no fault divorce, which is just, right, I woke up unhappy and I don't feel sexy anymore. So sorry, kids, but the family is over and daddy's out, and mommy's new boyfriend is going to come and live with you guys. That is what I'm so against, because of the statistical rates of abuse among children. It's about 10 and a half times higher, the risk of abuse, when you don't have your biological dad in the house. So that's my other big beef with feminism. It promised women and children additional safety, right? You guys have to remember historically that suffrage is happening at the same time that prohibition is coming about, and the women's temperance movement is really picking up steam. And there was a ton of propaganda. It's always propaganda, right? Ton of propaganda that all the men were alcoholics, right? All the men are alcoholics who just drink all day and come home and beat their wife. Now, that wasn't true either, but it was pushed because of the temperance movement and certain powers behind that wanted prohibition. So it was also co-opted and used in feminism to say, you can't take the risk, with these men. They could become alcoholics and they're just going to beat you. And so you need to be free and liberated and have your own money and have your own career. And it turns out that statistically now we can look over all the data. The National Incidence Study is conducted by the government about every 15 to 20 years or so, 10 to 15 years. There's been 4 of them since 1978. And what they do is they take data from all of the organizations across the country who deal with battered women, abused children. So it would be places like women's shelters, child protective services, charity organizations that help battered women, et cetera, et cetera. And they collect all of this data from different counties all over the country to try to analyze how much abuse is going on, who's doing the abusing, who's being abused, what context it happens under, right? We have 45 years of these studies now, and all of them show that The safest place for children is with both biological parents. Not even close. No other living situation even comes close to being as safe as that. And for women, cohabitating with a partner is far more dangerous as far as risk of abuse than living with your married husband. If you live with your husband you're married to, your rate of abuse is the lowest of any other living situation. And we see the highest domestic violence rates among lesbians who are cohabitating.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole idea that men are the threat, that men are the risk, that it's just too risky to be married, it's too risky to give men this power, is just baloney. I mean, we have a century of evidence now that we can look over and see that it's just not true. So all these promises that were made weren't kept. Feminism didn't deliver on any of it. So if the ideological roots are bad, if the philosophical and religious roots are bad, and the outcomes are bad, I'm not sure what the argument is in favor of pushing even more feminism, which is what we're seeing right now. Like I said, with the Barbie movie and all these other, all these other cultural, pop culture things that are really being pushed. And, you have every NGO, you have the United Nations, all these private public partnership philanthropy think tank places just pushing more and more and more women's empowerment, women's leadership summit, more feminism, more reproductive rights. And we are seeing a pushback now, but still these mainstream entities that do all the public policy steering are just pushing it heavier and heavier. And so all I'm trying to do is kind of present the argument against it and say, wait, nothing is lining up here. Why are you still pushing this? Like, what's the agenda?
Well, the agenda is to kill God the Father, right? That's the thing that I really appreciated about your book, is that you didn't whitewash the history of feminism or varnish it or say, well, they had some good points here. It's like, no, this is an occult, anti-God, anti-Christ movement, and has been from the start. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I had Zach Garris, who's a Presbyterian pastor. He wrote the book Masculine Christianity, and excellent book. Yeah. And he, in the first part of the book, talks about how feminism was a radical anti-family, anti-Christian movement from the start. And that ties into prohibition and all of that. Like, suffrage and prohibition were linked because it was positioning men as these oppressors, alcoholics. And so we have to cleanse society from the female perspective. And that's what Nancy Pearcey talks about in her new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Like, this unquestionable era of American history is beginning to be questioned. And it needs to happen. It's a sacred cow.
Yes, you're exactly right. And just nobody knows it, right? I mean, they're starting to now because of all the people you just mentioned, and there's others, Janice Fiumenko has done some good stuff on this. I didn't even know most of these people until after my book came out. And I'm kind of glad, because I'm like, I got to do my own unique perspective and my own work on it. But now that I'm seeing all the work of these other people and how we are all finding the same things, the same trends, the same ideas, it kind of does validate what I had found. And I'm sure that they probably feel the same way. So it's like, I'm very glad that this stuff is starting to be questioned, because like I said, it's bad enough for women and it's bad enough for men. But it just, when I see what's happening to children, it's like they're completely unprotected because mom's at work all day, dad's cut out of their lives more often than not. And so they are being exposed to every horrible ideology out there, every destructive force that wants them to destroy themselves is just coming at them right through their phone, and there's nobody there to kind of provide any pushback, because they're in a state institution most of their life, and then they're on their phone the rest of the time. So where's going to be the stabilizing force or the protective force? There isn't one anymore. And if I were the demonic, that's exactly what I would want. That's exactly what I'd be going for. Remove the people with the most vested interest in protecting their offspring so that we have access. And you see this in a lot of the rainbow Skittles movement stuff. I'm trying to, just in case I don't know where you'll put this. So
on YouTube.
Okay, yes. So the Skittles rainbow people love this idea. They love the idea of, oh, you don't need dads, and what's a family anyway, right? And a lot of the feminist philosophers of the 70s were really big into this idea of family with anyone except your dad, right?
Yeah.
Anyone except it. Kinship building outside of the biological family. My next book has a lot in it on like the Russians and the Eastern Bloc communists and how feminist ideology was pushed there
Mm-hmm.
by the same people, funded by the same people, but with a slightly different twist, with a little bit of a different ideology pushed, because in the West they used more of a liberal democratic kind of philosophy, and there they used like straight up Marxist collectivism.
Mm-hmm.
And the Eastern feminists like Alexandra Kollontai, who was the first
Yep.
Bolshevik female head of state and diplomat, in 1917 was already writing literature about how she foresaw a future without biological families,
Mm-hmm.
without parents, that all the children would be raised communally with no idea who mom was or who dad was. And the reason is because all of the bourgeois capitalist stuff she didn't like was passed down through like, paternal lineage. So men, when they get a family, when they get a wife and they have children, they work really hard at accumulating resources to pass down as a legacy to their offspring for their future generations. So to preserve their, from a strictly atheist worldview, you would see it as passing your genetic material into the future. From a Christian worldview, we see it more as like leaving a patriarchal legacy of provision and protection for your future generations. And she didn't want any of that. She said everyone's allegiance should be to the state. And fathers get in the way of that. So they have to be removed. So the first things she did as the Commissar of Social Welfare in Russia was to make abortion not only illegal for the first time in history anywhere in the world, but to make it paid for in a state Russian hospital up until the time of birth, all the way up to 40 weeks or whatever, with no questions asked, just free state paid state abortion. And then the other thing was she made marriage no longer a sacrament of the church, just a legal license you would file with the state that could be dissolved at any reason for any time. So they had no fault divorce. Now, when Stalin came to power, about a decade after that, they had 3 abortions for every 1 live birth in Russia. Their population was absolutely imploding, and they had just been through World War I and a great famine. So Stalin said, we can't have this. There won't be Russia in another decade if we keep this going. So he did temporarily put a kibosh on that. And that's why, but now still to this day, Russia has some of the highest abortion rates in the world. But this is the result, no matter how this ideology is disseminated, you end up with the same result. And that's because it's the same spiritual entities behind this agenda, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, the things you're talking about are woven throughout that presentation that I gave back in February. And also I read the book, Libido Dominandi by E. Michael Jones.
Yes.
Yeah. Who spends a lot of time on Alexander Kollontai and this whole feminist evolution beginning in the French Revolution. It's insane to actually look at history for what it is from the primary source documents and not simply accept the mainstream narrative, the collegiate narrative, or what we just kind of take for granted through the media, to actually look at what these people said, what they believed, and what they caused in the countries that they were allowed free reign in.
Yeah. Yeah. And standpoint theory they didn't just leave it to feminism. It started as strictly a feminist narrative. And then Sandra Harding, who had kind of invented it, she had a biology degree. So she worked really hard to get it pushed into the sciences as well. And so like James Lindsay has talked a lot about how standpoint theory has destroyed science. Like if you want to know, like people are wondering, how can the mainstream prestigious science institutions be the ones pushing this transformer stuff, right? Saying that you can just chop off parts like Mr. Potato Head and swap them out. What kind of science is this? Well, that's because standpoint theory infiltrated the sciences as well. So now we no longer have any sort of objective science, because that's toxic masculinity, right? That's white, straight male stuff. So we have to do even the hard sciences via standpoint theory, which of course doesn't work, but that's why everything is insane right now. And there's lots of people who've done really big, like in-depth pieces on how standpoint theory ruined science. like I said, James Lindsay. And I was just watching a really great YouTube video on it the other day that unfortunately I can't remember who did it right now. But yeah, this is it's this Gnostic kind of idea, right? That like the world is bad, society is bad, and so we have to escape it and we have to destroy it and we have to tear everything down, and then out of that we'll build some utopia. And it's never worked. It's never going to work. And it's not just because the ideas are bad. It's not just because utilitarian calculus doesn't actually work. It's because fundamentally this world is a spiritual battle, but like you said, it's God the Father who is the one that loves us and wants to redeem us. And so all the other forces fighting against that are just going to cause more decay, more suffering, more problems. And that's where we are right now, especially in the West, with so many people rejecting Christianity and having like these atheist worldviews. But really, there's no such thing as atheism. Even the
Right.
staunchest atheists always have some kind of other underlying worldview for how things work that tends to be spiritual, whether they want to admit it or not, you know?
You see the roots of this rebellion really in Genesis, where the serpent tempts Eve, and ye shall be like God. Effectively, God's holding out on you. You can be God. And Paul
Yes.
says later that Adam wasn't tempted or deceived. Adam wasn't deceived. Eve was deceived. So you have this model right there in the very beginning in the garden where you had this women's rebellion and men's passivity. And then you run that out thousands of years, and voila, here we are. And I guess the question that I'm sitting with is, yes, of course, men need to step forward, to take leadership. I think that's the nature of everything I do. But men stepping forward doesn't mean automatically that women will step back. That these two things are not linked. So what can we do? What do you see that works? Because we had talked about rationality, women being more rational, attempting to combat this. Right. Does that work? It doesn't not work, but can rationality combat irrationality?
Well, here's kind of how I see it. So the domain of men, and this is the burden of men. Women have the burden of childbirth and child raising. It's never easy. It's the most valuable and fulfilling thing you'll ever do. But I've had 5 children, and I'm not going to sit here and tell everybody, oh, it's just easy peasy. I took the easy life. I
Right.
didn't, but I would never go back and change it. Like I'm super happy with, my decision to do what I did in life. But for men, I think the burden is you guys have to always be the ones holding the boundaries.
Yeah.
You have to be the ones who are always saying no to people. I saw this with my husband when I really started to understand what men go through more is when we had 4 teen and preteen daughters at the same time.
Mm.
We have 4 girls. So when they were all kind of between like 9 years old and 19 years old, he would say every day, it doesn't matter what I do, somebody's going to run to their room crying because daddy was mean. Even if he's not mean, it's just because he said no, right?
Mm.
He has to be the one who's always just going, no, sorry, no, sorry, no, you won't, no, you can't do that. No. And I'm the one that kisses the boo-boos and rubs your back and makes you feel better. Now, I always back him up. So that's why I think our kids have turned out so good because we're always on the same page. But if it were just me, I'd be so much more likely to give in all the time. They tug on my little heartstrings and I just want to say yes. But he knows it's his job and that he's responsible for telling them no when they need to be told no. And men have that responsibility society wide to kind of put their foot down and say no. And what you just talked about with Adam in the garden is the same thing that kind of happened with feminism. And I always say simps are the ones that will be the death of all of us because it's this inclination to men love women, right? Men do love women. You guys love us. There's something in you that does want to give us what we want and make us happy and see us smile. So men kind of want to give in. And Adam kind of gave in because he wanted, it's not because he, like you said, he wasn't deceived. He
Mm-hmm.
just didn't want to tell her no. And he wanted to go with her wherever she was going, which was the big mistake. And that's what happened with feminism. You got these men who are the wealthy industrialist billionaires of the golden age, the Gilded Age, are the same kind we have now, like the Bill Gateses and the Elon Musks, who they always have some woman that's taking half their fortune and running off with another guy, or they have like, Elon's got 10 kids with 5 different women or something. And they're not good at holding the line because they're kind of nerds who got really famous and wealthy because they're smart or because they were strategically placed in a time and place.
Yeah.
So it's like a revenge of the nerds simp problem that we have, where if really powerful men give in to women, you have this repeats in archetypes throughout all of history, like Samson and Delilah, right? It's always a man kind of giving into a woman that he really is into is always his big downfall. And I think the thing that's hard for men, that's their burden, is going to be this idea of how do we firmly but benevolently take back power and control for the most part in society. I know when women hear me say that, it causes this knee-jerk discomfort. And I know that when I say things like submit, right, that word causes this knee-jerk discomfort. And it's conditioning. It's
Yes.
normal. It's normal for you, if you're a woman hearing me talk this way, to have this uneasy feeling in you when you hear me say these things. But you have to decondition this impulse that men having power or having control or being in authority is inherently bad. It's not the sex of the person with authority is not what makes it inherently bad. As we just talked about, men being benevolent and not inherently evil. So I think men's challenge is taking back the reins and being able to reinstitute the boundaries of the castle wall to keep society stable and make safe homes and places for children and women to live, and say, we love you, you're great, we want what's best for you, and that's why we're no longer going to go along with this feminist stuff. We're just, we're not going to be vengeful and wrathful, but we are going to take back our rightful place of authority and hierarchy as God has created us. And they're going to have to. This is the choices you guys have. It's either going to happen the hard way or the much harder way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So either the men decide enough of this experiment, we're going to benevolently kind of take back the reins of authority as we should, or we're going to have a catastrophic collapse that will necessitate a strong man coming in and putting society back together. And that's never comfortable. That's usually pretty brutal. And that's what we will end up going back to if somebody doesn't kind of put the brakes on this soon. Because you cannot have, there's a girl I debated that a clip with her went viral. I think it's got like 500,000 views or something now, where she insisted to me that she and her feminist friends could get the power grid back up after like an EMP. I said, if there was like an EMP that took out the power grid completely, are you and your girlfriends, your feminist girlfriends, going to go out and like, get the electric grid back up? And she was like, yeah, sure, totally. We totally can. We have tools now. And the reason it went viral is because it was so absurd, right? People are going, this girl probably, you'd have to tell her to unplug it and plug it back in if her computer wasn't working, but she's going to go restore the power grid. Like, does she have any idea? Are they going to be putting up cell phone towers and launching satellites so that the cell phones are working again? No. So if the men don't do this, we're going to be in a situation where someone's going to have to do it, and that's not going to be fun for anybody. But it kind of remains to be seen how it's going to go.
Yeah, and I think the complexifying factor of all this is that, men built these institutions in order to make society more convenient, easy, these giant meta technologies that manage everything for us. And all these institutions have now been captured by this ideology. And how can one man or even a group of men stand against these feminist captured institutions? That seems to me to be the hinge point, is that the institutions are now leveraged against the individual. And so we as men, we can take authority in our own homes, perhaps even in our own workplaces, but the time is late to begin building institutions.
Yes, you're totally right about that. As far as that goes, I mean, having studied kind of the history of power dynamics and the ruling elite, there's probably always going to be these powerful ruling elite who are antithetical to God and to God the Father. But there have been times in history where they've been put back at bay, where they've kind of stuffed the toothpaste back in the tube, at least to the extent that we could have pretty functioning society and more peaceful, more benevolent times. Of course, you and I as Christians, we kind of know that there's never going to be an Edenic state again until the return of Christ and he restores everything. But I do tell people, though, that really, it is possible, as bad as the world is, there have been worse times. There have been people who have had families and had successful marriages and families and brotherhood, and the church has survived incredible persecution throughout history. So it's possible. The situation we're in now is pretty dire, but my husband and I have been able to do it. And like you said, on an individual level, people can do that. And to the extent that more and more people do, the people around you notice that, and they kind of go, if it's a white pill for anyone, I do get a ton of emails and messages from women saying, I was in university finishing law school, and I had this nagging feeling for the last year that all I wanted to do was get married and have babies. And I knew everybody in my life wouldn't agree, but, I quit law school and I got married, and I'm staying home with my 2-year-old, and I'm pregnant again, and I'm going to homeschool. And thank you so much for making me feel okay about that. Thank you for giving me the courage to take that leap, even though I didn't feel safe about it because the people around me weren't supportive, but I couldn't be happier that I'm doing it. So that's why I think the Bible says that if you do what you're supposed to be doing, that's the best way to save the people around you, because if they see you do it, they're more likely to do it. And I do think there's hope. There's always hope. We have hope in Christ. So I think there's some good signs you're seeing. Like, it's not that we agree with everything Andrew Tate says or his prescriptions for people, or some of the red pill describes the problems really well.
Yes.
As a Christian, I don't always agree with the prescriptions, right? I don't want men getting vasectomies at 20. Please don't do that. But I do think it's a good sign that there's a lot of pushback. I think that men are looking for masculinity. I think women are looking for femininity. I think that if you allow women to be mothers, we have this incredible drive for motherhood. It's just that the culture beats it out of us from the time we are babies. And again, this Barbie movie opens with a sequence of little girls playing with baby dolls in the opening sequence. It's like a spoof on 2001, A Space Odyssey. And then they see Barbie, sexy Barbie, and they start bashing their baby dolls against the rocks, smashing the baby dolls, because we want to play with Barbie now. She's sexy and has cool outfits and accessories. So I think if we can push back on that and tell women, hey, you know what? It's actually really fun and cool and awesome to be a mom. It's a totally valid life choice. You should give it a try. It's great. That goes a long way. And then I think if men who are, I know some people don't like the phrase, but let's just, because everyone knows what it means, high value men. If the high value men start rewarding virtue, chastity, motherhood, instead of big booby girls on webcams who are doing, NPC or ASMR or whatever stuff, selling their bathwater to simps. If we start rewarding that behavior in women, you're going to see a lot more of it, because women still will do whatever gets them the most attention from men. Attention is women's currency, more than money or handbags even, right? That's, in fact, male attention is usually how they get the handbags or whatever the other status symbols are. But if the high value men kind of start making it like, oh, you're a 304? No, thanks. I would like this 20-year-old church-going virgin who wants to be a mother. Will it make all the feminists mad? Yes, it will. But will you see more women start to act that way and hold those values? Yes, and it's twofold. It's because they do want the attention. They do want the best man. That's our primary biological imperative. And they do want to reproduce. Most of us want to be mothers. Historically, there's been a tiny percent of women who are just not built for it or don't want it. That's fine. They've always been there. They can go be nuns. They can be school marms. They can, be academics or whatever they want to be. But most women do want to be moms. They do. So if you just make that the cool thing again, I think some of the men who are gaining this influence could do that theoretically. I don't know if it'll happen. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think if the really desirable men suddenly start talking about the virtues they want to see in women and what they're looking for and what they think should be rewarded, you'll see more of that. But as long as having 1 million Instagram followers because you're posting pictures of yourself in a thong gets you the most attention, that you're going to see a lot of girls do that.
Do you have time for just one more quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So what I see as the wild card in all this is sexual liberation. That sexual liberation was the liberation of women's sexuality from the constraints of marriage. You created all of this supply, let's say, of sex, and then it creates all of this demand, right? And so you have men that are more tempted by sex outside of marriage than sex inside of marriage, along with all the married sex is unsatisfying propaganda, et cetera, which is documented to be not true. So part of this is reining women's sexuality back in. And that's goddess worship, right? Goddess worship is inevitably tied, as you talked to that earlier. So you have men essentially worshiping the goddess of women's sexuality, which is direct contradiction to the God the Father. So, and someone said on Twitter, I think it was on Twitter, that we need to bring women shaming women for unchaste behavior back. What do you think about that?
I do agree with it, and I get in terrible trouble for it all the time.
Good. That's what we do here.
You might know from talking to me now that I'm actually a pretty nice person. I think I'm a pretty nice person. If you just follow me on Twitter, though, you probably think I'm a little bit mean. And it's because because of the nature of that app, I am often kind of pushing back, clapping back, if you will, against these types of women who want this sexual liberation. And why? Because it's their main source of power. And no, they don't want to give it up. So the only way they're going to give it up is if there's some shame involved. And again, people hear the word shame and there's a knee-jerk reaction to be like, she's bad, she's mean. You shouldn't shame people. However, always in society, always, we are either incentivizing or disincentivizing certain behaviors by whether we see it as a positive thing and applaud it, or whether we see it as a negative thing and shame it to a certain degree. That's why there's all this talk about Lizzo and healthy at every size and body shaming stuff. And it's like, it's kind of the same idea. I wish we could all live in this cozy kindergarten world where we can tell everyone that everything's fine, everything's permissible, every life choice is equally valid, every worldview is equally valid, but that's not reality. That's not how things work. And the result of trying to do that is you have 500-pound women who are physically incapacitated by the time they hit 30, and they're probably not going to last past 40. I don't think that's nice. I don't think that's nice at all. So I look at this the same way. I have gotten messages from women in their 50s and 60s who say, I'm listening to your audiobook right now and I'm bawling my eyes out because I fell for this stuff. And now I'm too old and it's too late and I can't go back and I don't know what to do. And it's heartbreaking. Like, I'll get teared up and upset reading these messages from women. So I'm like, better that they get mad at me now for saying to them, hey, before you post another booby picture or another OnlyFans video, think about what your children, if you have children someday, are they going to see that when they're 50? Are you going to be proud of this later? To try to get them to think of it that way. A little bit of shame is a good thing, right? If somebody steals, we shame them. If somebody murders someone or R-words someone, we shame that because it's bad behavior. It's bad for the victim. It's bad for the perpetrator. It's bad for society. So there are behaviors that objectively, I believe, should be shamed to some degree. Now, this doesn't mean that reformed women should be treated like garbage. This is another thing I disagree with. I don't think a high value man is obligated to marry you just because you reformed either. So if you used to do OnlyFans and you have a body count sky high to the moon, but now you're 30 and your biological clock is ticking and you've decided to come to Christ and change, that's great, but it doesn't mean you're automatically entitled to like some really high status guy. You might have to settle for Joe the plumber, who is a really nice person, but maybe he's 5'9", you still have a great life. You will still have a wonderful Christian life, a great family, a wonderful man, but this 6 foot, 6-figure, 6-pack stuff has got to go, for one thing. And the other thing is, we shouldn't be encouraging women to do things that actually encourage their physical, mental, and spiritual destruction. telling women to open themselves up sexually is extremely dangerous for so many reasons. Leads to, a lot of women having abortions they regret later, to getting them, like we discussed earlier, gets them into situations where they're more likely to encounter abuse or harm. It destroys their ability to pair bond. It destroys their self-esteem. And then they hit the wall at 35 and they've got another 40, 50 years of life that they now have to live with that history and that past and all that damage, and they have to try to heal from it. Again, encouraging that is not nice. The nice thing is trying to talk some sense into them and shake them a little bit now while they're young and they can maybe turn it around. And I would love to see, like, for my daughters growing up, that maybe they won't have to do what I did, which is fight the entire culture, which tells them, take your clothes off, stick your butt out and take a picture, let boys have sex with you when you're really young, all these things, do polyamory, have multiple boyfriends, do stuff with girls, all these things that are encouraged in the culture that I know will destroy them. And they're a rebellious teenager going, why do I have to have the strict mom? Why do I have to have the parents that are always telling me no? But now they're 20 and 22, my oldest, and they've both, like, multiple times said to me, I used to think that you were like the strict, boring mom. And I'd always be like, oh, I wish I could have fun like my friends do with their mom. But I'm so glad that you didn't. I'm so, like, thank you so much for not raising me like that. Thank you for caring enough to tell me no, and try to, not let the culture raise me, because I'm seeing what it's doing to my friends or like older ladies that they know at work or something like that. And they're very happy that they had parents that cared enough to tell them no. So it's not nice to encourage women in everything they do. It's not nice or kind. It's not being nice. Telling people to do things that destroy them isn't nice. So we need to push back against this. It's okay to be 500-pound stuff. We need to push back against the promiscuity and all these life choices that we know. Like I said, we have tons of data. We have our own eyeballs. We can look around and see what this produces. It's not good for young women. So I always say, who's really the one that cares about women? Is it you feminists who are telling them to do all this god awful self-destructive stuff that also, by the way, prevents them from ever having salvation and reconciling with God? Because when you tell young women, you don't need humility, you don't ever have to apologize. You are perfect the way you are. You don't need saving. You don't need forgiveness. You are basically putting a giant wall between them and God. You're putting a giant wall between them and their salvation. So I think it is not me who is the one that's mean and doesn't care about women. I think it's the feminists who are destroying them in every dimension of their lives.
Yeah, there's a real hesitation that a lot of people have to tell women what they can and can't do with their bodies. My body, my choice, right? If I want to put a baby in it and take a baby out of it, and I want to put in whatever I want, eat food, whatever, it's just like, we can't tell women. You can't tell women anything because women are cosmic victims. It's the goddess worship thing. Same thing.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, it also kind of comes, it's definitely that's the spirit and the root of where all of it comes from. And then we have the extra complicating factor of being American. And being American and believing in Americanism, which I went through my libertarian phase in my 20s, when you have this idea that authority is across the board bad and that liberation is across the board good, and that, hey, man, just do you, just do you, bro. Like, this idea saturates the American spirit as well. And so we're partially fighting that. And I'm sympathetic to it. Like, I understand where that comes from because I was there at a certain point in my life too. But the truth of the matter is that not all things are permissible and not all things are good for you. And not you need God the Father there to tell you no and tell you to repent so that he can forgive you and restore you. And you need your father there in your life, and you need your husband there in your life to put down boundaries for you when maybe you can't always do it yourself. Women, we have hormone cycles. We have a lot of emotions going on. We tend to be, it's a good thing. It's a good thing as mothers. You want us to be more empathetic. You want us to be more sensitive, because, you know, if you're going to have a baby attached to you for 2 straight years, whether you've slept or not and all of these things, you want them to have these instincts. That's a good thing. But the men are there to protect us when we can't really do it ourselves, when we're too hormonal to think straight or too sleep deprived to think straight, or we get our heartstrings tugged at. That's why marketing is another big part of the piece of the puzzle. Is Edward Bernays, with his invention of marketing, you know, he was kind of famous for pushing smoking on women, but he developed marketing out of psychoanalysis and psychology. He was related to Sigmund Freud and like a lot of the other psychoanalysis guys that came out of the early 20th century. And they figured out that if they could put the control of most of the household spending in the hands of women, oh boy, you know, like that, just, they had a field day. Then they could just aim all of the marketing for products, for services, for whatever at the women. And it's very easy to manipulate them. That's the other reason it's great for them if women vote, because women can be very easily swayed. When you see these we're going into an election cycle, when you see campaign ads talking about, you know, oh, this party wants to starve the old people, and this party wants to take away children's lunches, and this party hates, you know, people who are on Medicare, and you'll see so much of this advertising that's designed to tug at your heartstrings. Or late at night when the SPCA commercials come on and they have the Sarah McLachlan song playing and all the sad abused animals, and they're like, call now and give us money. I mean, women are call and donate. So it's a lot of that too. Our maternal instincts are continually weaponized against us by these kinds of people. So men, like my husband, will see that. He kind of has to do that on my behalf sometimes, because my first instinct is to say yes to everyone and to, what's wrong, honey? How can I make it better? Do you want me to cook you something to eat? Should I, you know, what can I do for you? And there are people who will take advantage of that. And so sometimes my husband will see that and he'll be like, hold on a second, you know, are you sure this person deserves your time and help and sympathy? Or could they have an agenda, right? Whereas I probably wouldn't think of that. So women need to start seeing men as our protectors again, because they truly are. And I think if you go read all of my stuff, I think I do a good job of laying out a good case and a good argument for that, and against this idea that just if you eliminate all the men, it eliminates all the problems. It doesn't. It just puts a new set of bigger problems in your lap. And then if you are ever abused, if you are ever exploited, who do you go to stop the bad man? Another man, a good man, right? If you're in an abusive relationship with a man, you go to the police, you go to a judge for a restraining order, you go to your father, you go to your brother who's big and scary to get rid of this bad man. So yeah, I think that we do need men to take the reins back for that reason, because women are just so susceptible to propaganda. But there's a good side to that too. We can use the same kind of tactics to allow women to go back to being comfortable in their feminine roles, being comfortable as mothers, being fulfilled and happy as, you know, the lady at church that if she's not there one Sunday, nothing goes right? You know, like coffee hour doesn't work, and you know, the potluck afterwards wasn't organized, and the charity that we were going to do doesn't get done if she's not there. Women had a crucial role in society in all of like taking care of the sick, the elderly, the young, the returning war veterans, running children's orphanages, things like this. And we don't have those things anymore because we told women to go to the cubicle and the state's supposed to come in and do all that stuff. And it's been catastrophic. So we'd be so much better off if we could embrace traditional roles of each sex again. And each one of us is doing what we do best, but in cooperation with one another rather than in competition.
And I think that what isn't well understood is that both men and women give something up in that arrangement, is that men are called to be sacrificial as husbands. Like it's not easy being a husband or a father, you know, and being committed, nor is it easy being a wife and a mother. It's not comfortable for either person. No one quote unquote gets away free from that arrangement, but it is godly and it is prosperous and it does lead to fulfillment, if not, you know, profit.
Yeah, definitely. And in the Orthodox Christian church, we actually still have marriage as a sacrament, and we see it as a path to salvation. When you marry your spouse, you are both responsible for each other's salvation because of that sacrifice. It's called an ascetic sacrifice, right? I'm giving up myself for you, and you're giving up yourself for me. We're both learning to sacrifice. And this is why I think it's so dangerous that feminism pushes this message of sexual empowerment on very young women. So starting at like 15, 16, 17, these girls are getting the idea that your sex is your sexuality is your power, and that you should never have to sacrifice or give up anything. You're perfect the way you are. You should, have the power and control because of your sexuality, without also telling them that this is a very Faustian deal, because this is a very short period of time in your life that's temporary. It doesn't last. You're not going to be, they're looking at Jane Fonda and like the Swimsuit Illustrated cover with Martha Stewart on there, sexy at 80, and they're thinking that this is how things work. No, it's like all a demonic delusion to make you think that when you're 80, you're still going to have this sexy power. And I have a friend even who said that to me. I was saying this and she said, I'm still going to be sexy when I'm 60. I don't know about you. And I was just like, oh,
man.
It's kind of, to me, it's kind of embarrassing and demeaning too, to tell elderly women who are like well past menopause to try to like flaunt some kind of sexuality. I think it's degrading to them. But I think that the reason they like to push this sexual power stuff on really young women is because, like I said, it gets them to wall themselves off from repentance. It gets them to totally neglect self-development. You can't do self-improvement if you think you're already perfect the way you are. Right? So telling them they're perfect the way they are, and, just Photoshop your body until you can get the most likes on your Instagram. It's a terribly destructive thing. And, I think that women are more important than that. I think we have a higher calling than that. And those young girls who never learn self-sacrifice struggle really hard when they get older. This is the other thing about it. You spend all of your 20s, your late teens, and then all of your 20s, and maybe even a little bit of your 30s with this mentality. You're not going to get to 35, go, oh shit, I've been doing everything wrong. I'm going to reform and turn it around and like try to get married and have a baby without tremendous difficulty. That's an extremely hard switch to flip. Because even if you find a great guy, and even if he can support you so you can have a baby, for you to go from this self-oriented view of the world where everything's about you and your sexual power and getting clicks and likes and attention, and I'm perfect the way I am, to suddenly, okay, it's not really about me anymore. And maybe I only got 4 hours of sleep last night, but someone still has to get up and make the breakfast. And this baby is crying, so I have to go get the baby, whether I'm ready to wake up or not. The sacrificial nature of motherhood is an extremely tough transition for these women. And I've seen it in my own life with women I know really well, that when they try to suddenly switch over and do the trad mom stuff in their mid 30s, it's really hard on them. It's hard to get pregnant. It's hard to make that mental switch. It's hard to cope all of a sudden with your life being not about you anymore. So I'm often really thankful that the Lord saw fit for me to be a mother when I was young, because I think it was one of the best things that could have happened to me. I never built my entire view of myself around my attractiveness or my sexuality. It was built around other things, like what I could do for the people around me, service to the people I love in my life, things of value that I could provide to the world, my intelligence, things like that. And I think that's much better for women. I think it destroys them when we do it the other way.
But a lot of women, they don't actually feel the urgency to become a wife and mother until their body starts telling them, because no one tells them in their life. So one of the things that I'm running into on Twitter is like, hey, Christians, you got to start discipling your daughter to be wives and mothers under the age of 25. You got to start doing that. And I hear crickets when I say that. Okay, good. I'm not alone. And it's like, right. Okay. It's like, oh no, women should be wives and mothers, but not my daughter.
Right.
Obviously, right. Right. And so what can we begin doing to address that younger generation? It's like, hey, you better start thinking about this before your body wakes you up to this, because by that point it's quite late. It's quite late in many respects.
Yeah, you're totally right about that. And that's one of the hardest pieces of conditioning to push back against. And this is where the lack of support for women who want to be mothers comes from. So like it really started with the baby boomer generation being super heavily programmed that you have to have a college degree or your life's going to be bad, right?
Yeah.
If you don't, I mean, my parents just absolutely pounded this into my head. And so did every teacher I had, especially because I was in like a gifted kid program when I was young. So it was like, oh, you're going to go to college. You have to go to college. Don't even think about not going to college. So what good Christian parents tell their kids now, their daughters, is you have to do well in school. You must go to college and have a degree. Once you get out of college, you have to build a career. Once you're financially stable and all those things are set, then you can begin to think about looking for a husband and having a family. Now, does that work for some people? Sure. Does it cause serious problems for many people? Yes, it does. And here's why. Once a girl has invested all of the K through 12 years in her education and achieving enough in the education system to get into a good college and get a scholarship or things like that, and then she goes another 4, maybe 6 years in university, she comes out with, now what, 16 to 18 years of investment of hard work that she's put in. She's probably going to come out with an average of 35 to 45,000 in college debt. That's the average now. And by the way, most college debt is not held by women. 65% of all college debt is held by women. You wonder why they don't want to have babies. It's because they get out with all this debt, all this investment put in. And of course they feel like, well, now I have to build a career because I got to make enough money to pay off all these student loans and I don't want to have wasted all. Why tell women to invest all this time and effort in an education if you're going to be a mom? Like, this drove me nuts about the Trump administration. They had this huge program with Ivanka Trump pushing mothers into the workplace. We're going to get mothers back to work. We're going to make it easier for mothers to go back to work. And I was like the lone voice in the wilderness going, why? Because if you want to know why the average woman only has 1.3 children in America now, that's why. It would make no sense to all of a sudden when you're 30 and you've invested all of your life's efforts up to that point in your education and career to go, okay, now it's time to stay home and have kids. Who would do that? It makes no sense. So why are we telling them that? And it's because we've had decades of propaganda scaring the shit out of everybody that if your daughter doesn't have her own degree and her own career and her own money, she's going to end up with an abusive husband. That's always the underlying threat. And so we fearmonger women to death about what could happen to them if they are in the vulnerable situation of being a stay-at-home mom and dependent on their husband. But think about this, everybody. Why don't we also fearmonger career women about all the things that can go wrong there? Do we bother to tell young women that the vast majority of women who get a degree don't even get a job in the thing they got the degree in, or they make way less money than they thought? The average woman makes $40,000 a year with a degree. She's got $40,000 in debt. She makes $40,000 a year. That's not a very good trade-off. And we don't say, oh, you want to be you want to be a hairstylist? What if you cut off a finger? What if you become allergic to the chemicals you're working with? What are you going to do then? Or like 80% of psychology degrees are now earned by women. We don't tell women, why are you getting a degree in psychology? The market is completely saturated and you're never going to get a good paying job. This is a terrible return on investment. We don't ever say that to them. So again, it's this lack of rationally and objectively looking at, okay, why am I picking this path? What's the return on investment? How's my life going to go? What about the second half of my life, right? It's all based on fear mongering and propaganda that women are at risk if they don't have a degree in their own money. And that's just simply not true. It's a silly, it sounds right because you've heard it so much, but it's actually not the case. We do not see this epidemic of married women like just being abused at insane rate. We don't see that. What we see is the opposite. Those women tend to fare better, report better happiness, have All the statistics suggest they are in a safer living situation, a more stable living situation. They have a brighter, financial future ahead, and they have a more fulfilling second half of their lives. And we don't say that to working women. So I think that this idea that college is for everyone is brand new. We never used to tell women that every single woman has to go to college. We never said every single man has to go to college. University was invented for like that top 5 or 10% of really smart people who needed specific academic training in a certain field. It was never meant to be for every single person. That happened in 1966 when the United Nations figured out that university systems were a great place for indoctrination and social engineering. And so we're going to push everyone there, right? And because they did want to steer towards certain career paths and fill certain fields and things like that. But it was never this idea that just the powers that be care so much about women. No, sorry, they don't. They don't care about you. They don't care about your safety. The corporation you go to work for is going to replace you the day after you die. They'll go, oh, Mary died. That's so sad. Well, you better get that job posting up because we got to fill that spot. Whereas if you're a mother like I am, if something happens to me, I'm not replaceable. My loss would be felt for a long time to come. Not that I want that, but it means that if I want a legacy, this is the way to build a legacy, not by going to work in a cubicle or try to be a Sex in the City girl or something like that. So it's got a lot to do with propaganda and messaging and the fact that people don't look to the church anymore for their purpose in life, for guidance. Nobody goes to their priest for counsel anymore. They go to a psychologist who's going to tell them all this feminist nonsense, So it's a symptom of a spiritual problem. But as far as the practical way to solve it, I mean, it's a really tough nut to crack. I think you and I have talked about some good ideas and some things that would be helpful. But we'll just have to see if people listen. We'll have to see if people like me and all the others that we've talked about are going to be listened to, and if people will, like, what we're saying is going to sit well with people, and if they'll follow it, or if they're going to decide that more girl boss feminism, Taylor Swift and Beyonce stuff is the way to go, I guess.
Yeah. Do we engage the war? Do we withdraw from the battlefield? Do we let it all collapse and enjoy the decline? Do we fight the good fight on social media? Like I think these are questions that we all sit with every day.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, revolutions can go both ways, right? Like I said, if we got here this way, we can get out of it. But I don't know if that'll happen. What I do know is that each person listening to this can decide for themselves, and that's why I try primarily to get younger women to think about this. Like, people gave me a lot of criticism for working with Pearl and some of the like younger Gen Z crowd, but I'm like, why do I want to talk to women my age who are already past,
Right.
those years? I want to reach the younger girls that my daughters are friends with who are convinced that they are bisexual, who think that having a baby is gross and icky, and think that they're all like, this is so funny. Every single one of these girls, okay, is going to be either a veterinarian or a psychologist. Every friend that all of my daughters have, and I bet all of you listening, if you have young ladies in your life and you ask them what they want to do, they all think that. I'm like, first of all, you're taking care of people and animals. Why do you think you're drawn to this? Could it be that you have a motherly instinct? And then it's like, do you all really think you're going to be a veterinarian or a psychologist? Like, every little girl's going to grow up and do these same few jobs. No, I just think that it's a product of all the propaganda. So you can fight the propaganda war, you can fight the culture war. But that doesn't mean that we're just going to win, right? I think a lot of people have this black and white idea that, like, you either win or if you're not first, you're last, right? That kind of a thing. It's like, the whole world is never going to follow us. Christ tells us, that the world will hate you first. If the world hates you, it's because they hated me first. So we're never going to get the whole world on our side, but we can certainly make improvements. We can certainly give hope for people who are looking. I guess that's the point, right? It's like, if there's young women out there who are kind of like, I don't know, I feel like something's off. But I guess I'll just do what everyone's telling me. they usually end up looking and finding the truth. So for the people who want to find out what's going on, for the people who want to find out the truth, they'll probably get here at some point. I just hope they find it before it's too late for them. That's why I'm trying to tailor my message to younger people to the extent that I can. I'm a 45-year-old lady. I'm not like cool. Really, my kids tell me every day I'm not cool, but
They're kind of cool.
I'm trying my best. Yeah.
Well, do you want to talk about your work with Pearl a little bit? I mean, I know who she is. I don't follow her. I haven't watched her channel. It hasn't seemed like something that, it seems like probably something now that I should pay attention to, but I know that she's making a lot of waves and it looks like she's having a lot of fun as well, which is always the best thing to see.
Yeah, so she and I, like, it's kind of funny because in a way you'd think that we would be the least likely people to push this message. She was a semi-pro athlete. She's 6 foot tall volleyball player, very
Oh, wow.
athletic. She's been playing since she was young. Like 3 to 5 hours a day of her life growing up was, preparing for this career as a volleyball or basketball athlete. She's a diehard tomboy, but she's from a big family, and she was raised by two parents, so she had that going for her. And then I also have like a tomboy background. I'm a firearms instructor on the side.
Oh, wow.
I do CPL and basic pistol instruction with my dad. And like I lift weights and I listen to heavy metal and stuff like that. So I have like this very tomboy background growing up on farms. All my friends were guys and stuff like that when I was little. And then as I got older and became a mom, then I found my femininity and really embraced that side of myself as well, which is another reason why I don't like the trans stuff, because I feel like I would have been a prime target for that if I had been born 30 years later. I probably could have been convinced I was supposed to be a boy when I was little.
Mm-hmm.
But, like all girls, we go through our awkward years and then we become women and then we embrace our femininity through motherhood and things like that. So I do have a heart for those young ladies too who are being targeted with that propaganda. But what Pearl and I both she started to find like red pill stuff about 2 years ago, and she's a little bit, I would say, abnormally rational for a woman. The same thing's been said about me. Edward Dutton said, he said in his British voice, "Oh, you might be one of these minority of women that has the mind of a man, aren't you?" And I was like, maybe a little bit, you know what I mean? Part of my brain is very analytical that way. So I think we kind of looked around and went, this doesn't make sense. It's kind of just starts with this sense that things don't add up. And you're like, but why? And you're very curious. So you go digging and looking, and, she finds red pill stuff and I start looking into history, and we both kind of figured out different aspects of this feminism stuff. Now she's very provocative. She's very controversial. She knows that she is, but she's like, hey, if I'm not a little provocative, no one's ever going to hear what I'm saying anyway. So,
Right.
And she's not afraid to do it. And I admire that about her. So I was like, let's do a show or something. And I sent her my book and she was like, whoa, this is really good stuff. Like, let's do a show. So we did one stream together that did really, really well and got crazy good feedback. Then she was like, okay, let's get into this religion stuff a little bit, which I give her credit for, because in the red pill circles, that's not very popular.
Nope.
It's not very acceptable in a lot of those circles. So she got some pushback, but she's like, well, bring on a couple people you think would be good. So I brought Tim Gordon, who is a Catholic who's written a book on patriarchy. His wife wrote an awesome book called Ask Your Husband. She's a stay-at-home mom like me with a big family. And I brought Jay Dyer, who's an Orthodox Christian. And then Pearl brought Glenn Lawrence, who's a red pill guy, but a Protestant Christian. And we talked about this idea of infiltration of the institutions, which includes the church, by the way.
Oh,
the
yeah.
church has been targeted by the same powers because religious institutions are extremely influential. So if you're a wealthy billionaire philanthropist who wants to redesign society, you're going to target the churches, and they have. So we went over all of that evidence and explained how that works. So we may be doing some other stuff coming up that I can't tell you about yet, but it's kind of this idea, she gets accused of being a grifter all the time. So do I, but I think it's a little easier to target her because they're like, well, why aren't you married? Why don't you have kids? And she's like, look, I'm a product of the generation I was raised in too. Right. I only figured this out 2 years ago. Like, what do you want me to do? Like, poof a husband into existence? It's a little complicated for her at this point. So not that she doesn't want that. She does. But she's like, look, I'm just pointing out what's going on. I'm not saying I'm an example. I'm not giving people advice. I'm just asking the questions and presenting the information. Okay. So she really does. I've talked to her a lot in private, and she does believe in this stuff, right? She believes feminism is stupid and it's ruining everything. And she's like, I could have turned out totally different. Why was I raised to be an athlete? Like, why was there this big push for me to be an athlete and go to college? She's like, now I'm 26 and it's really hard for me to all of a sudden transition over to get married and have kids because, well, now she's already found some professional success. And like I said, it's just hard to like just flip a switch all of a sudden and be a trad wife. So for her personally, it's caused some struggle for her in her life. And she's like, look, I just see things how they are, and I'm just saying this is what I'm seeing, right? So that's kind of her perspective on it. And then mine is like, it's driven more by my maternal instinct and the future of my kids, and hopefully I'll have lots of grandkids. I'm really concerned about how children are growing up and what kind of homes they have, and I'm sure she's concerned about those things too. But we just have like this common interest, and we both just see it as a giant facade. We basically see it as a huge scam that's been run on everybody. And if you see that, don't you have an obligation to say something about it? So both of us just feel like, let's just get some attention on this. Let's start exposing stuff. Let's start talking about data and facts and history. And maybe once people actually examine this, rather than just being conditioned by propaganda, some of this will start to break down. And I feel like, I guess we could kind of end it on this sort of a note. This movement claims to be by women for women. I've been told my whole life that I owe it to these brave feminist activists who came before me, that I couldn't do anything if it wasn't for them, which isn't true. But I'm like, at the very least, if this is supposed to be for me, for my daughters, if it's supposed to be for Pearl, right? If feminism's for us, why don't we have a right to scrutinize it? Why don't we have a right to evaluate it in its totality and decide if we think it was good enough for us or not, if we think it made things better for us or not? Don't tell us that women deserve to be heard and women are important and this is all for women, and then also say you are not allowed to question it, and how dare you say anything negative about it, and don't you dare examine the outcomes of this revolution. I think that's absurd, and I think as women we have every right to decide if feminism actually helped us or if it was detrimental to us at the very least. So, I mean, that's how I feel about it. So I don't think, no matter how much hate mail I get, I don't think I'm going to be staying quiet about it anytime soon.
Nor do I think you should. I think that was beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
Well, this conversation has been an enormous blessing, and I have many female listeners. I think they're going to get a lot of it, but the male listeners as well. So thank you so much for your book, and thank you for your work, and thank you for again fighting the good fight on social media against this giant scam.
Yeah, well, same to you. And thank you so much for having me on. I love any opportunity to talk about this stuff. And I'm super happy that you came out of the new age and that you found Christ, because that's, like you said, it's a huge blessing for your life. And I don't think people know what a blessing that is until it happens for them. So if people kind of want to know about, Rachel, how did you become so based? Like, how'd you get so based? It's because I took the Christ pill, right? So, luckily, a side effect of my work has been a lot of people looking back into Christianity, looking back at the church. I get a lot of messages like that too. So, if I can help in that way, I'm happy to do that too.
Yeah, there's a giant New Age to Christ movement happening, and it's driving a lot of New Age influencers crazy because they can't stop it. It's also more to talk about.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, where would you like to send people to find out more about you and what you do?
Sure. You can go to my Substack. I've got a lot of, other work I publish on there. It's rwilson.substack.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, which is just Rachel Wilson, or you can buy my book on Amazon. It's Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation.
Wonderful. And it actually Amazon will actually bring it up in search results now, because it didn't when I looked for it in February.
Yeah, the feminists, the feminists tried to mass report my book as not being my own intellectual property to try to get it
Oh,
taken down. So I had to do a whole appeal with Amazon and prove that it was my book, and then they put it back up. But yeah, they've got troll reviews on my account that I can't get removed. So if you guys do read the book and you love it, I would totally appreciate a good review just to counteract some of the phony, they're obvious troll reviews. But for some reason, they're extremely hard to get removed. So
well,
yeah,
I'll go do that. So thank you again, Rachel.
thank you so much.